Find the clicker here. Good to see everybody this morning. It is good to be back with you here at Market Street Church of Christ on this beautiful Sunday morning. Yes, we had a wonderful trip. Andrew and I spent the last week up in Sevierville, Tennessee at polishing the pulpit. And yes, to answer your question, the pulpit is shiny right now. Yes, we did it. That is a phrase that it started out as a preacher's workshop. Many years ago, several preachers up in that area, in the Tennessee, northern Alabama area, would get together and they would have a workshop. Well, that expanded over the last 20 to 25 years to now this past week. There was over 4,600 members of the church that were attending. It's for all members. It's not just for preachers, but for all members. 4,600 attendees in Sevierville and almost 3,000 in Branson back in July. So to God be the glory that there are still wonderful things happening. Over, I think, 250 plus lessons, all kinds of activities. I was there also representing Good News Today. It was a wonderful week. A lot of great things happened. Preston and I did a lesson on the church plant. He gave it from the standpoint of the goers, and I gave the standpoint of the senders and some of the challenges and everything. And so it was a good week. And I certainly encourage each and every one of you, if you have the opportunity, to go either to Branson in July or go to Sevierville in Tennessee in August. And if you want to know more about it, come see me afterwards and we'll talk some more about polishing the pulpit. But now we're going to go into our study of Genesis, and we are currently, Dennis, could you click on that so that it'll advance? Just click on the first slide there for me, and it should advance after that. There we go. Thank you, sir. Now I've got it now. Thank you. So this is our last installment of this quarter of the book of Genesis. It's almost impossible to cover the book of Genesis. Well, it is impossible to cover the book of Genesis verse by verse in one quarter. It's just not going to happen with 50 verses. So we took a little bit different approach by looking at beginnings. And so as you can see, we are using this outline. It is the beginning of many things. The whole book of Genesis, that's what Genesis means, is beginnings. We have the beginning of everything, the world, and the beginning of sin, the beginning of society as we know it, a fresh beginning after the flood, and then a beginning of a new covenant, beginning of bitter rivals that are still with us today, a beginning of a chosen family, then that development, the beginning of the offspring of that chosen family, which then is the beginning of Israel, the nation of Israel. And now we're in the last two sections, and I thank Chris Davis for filling in for me last week and getting us up to chapter 39. As you can see, it was the beginning of a plan. This plan, which starts with the life of Joseph. The chapters 37 all the way up to 50 really deal with the life of Joseph. And I don't think there is a more compelling, interesting, drama-filled story in all the world than what happened with Joseph. I mean, there's so many movies that are out there that are epic in so many ways. I still don't think they can touch the hem of the garment when it comes to the epic story of Joseph. Starting out as a young man telling those dreams, and then those dreams coming into fruition many years later, being thrown into a pit, sold by his brothers. You can't make this stuff up. Hollywood's never had a story as good as the story of Joseph. And so that's where we are, and we're going to pick up there in chapter 39. So it started with Joseph in those dreams and being betrayed. And then there's the little side story of Judah and Tamar. It's an ugly story, but it is important because it has to do with the Messiah. And now we come into Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So many wonderful lessons there. Flee immorality. It's exactly what Joseph did. So you begin to see what kind of person Joseph is. In fact, here in a minute we're going to see where Pharaoh says the Spirit of God is upon him. And indeed, that's what you see all through his life. So we're picking up in chapter 40 where Joseph interprets two prisoners' dreams. So we know the story. Joseph fled from Potiphar's wife who was making advances upon him. She then lies about it, and Potiphar gets mad and throws him in prison. That's where we pick up the story. So in verse 1, it came to pass these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed a dream, both of them. So here we are. Joseph is in prison, been there for a while now. All of a sudden, here's these two other people that have been put in prison, and they have a dream. And Joseph comes in, he sees them, and he saw, verse 6, that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, verse 7, who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter to it." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Tell them to me, please. Stop right there for just 1 second. There's a key verse right there. Verse number 8. Do not interpretations belong to God? I want you to stop for just a moment and think in your mind all the different times that we have seen dreams come into play, even up to this point. Right here in the book of Genesis, we've already had dreams come to individuals. Can you think of any? Who comes to mind? Thinking back on the book of Genesis up to this point, and even if you want to think of beyond the book of Genesis, who can you think of had a dream come to them? What's that? Mary. Mary had a dream come to her. Very good. Who else? Joseph. Who else? What was that? Daniel. There's a good one. Daniel. There's still a few more. Jacob. Before we get to this point, Jacob had that dream where he saw the ladder and everything. Who else? There's one that has a really long name. It starts with an N. There you go, Nebuchadnezzar. So many people. Abimelech before this. So many people have had dreams. Now Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1 and 2 says, "In times past God spoke to the fathers through the prophets in many ways and many manners." And one of those ways is dreams. God indeed is the one that gives dreams. Do not interpretations belong to God? Dreams are one way that God uses or has used in the past to speak directly to man. Now, quick question. Does God still use dreams today to speak to man? I see some of you shaking your heads, but I would encourage you to read Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 again, what I just said. Because verse 2 of that says, "In these last days he speaks to us through his Son, Jesus." Now, how does he speak to us through Jesus? Jesus isn't here with us anymore. Well, Jesus said, "I'm going to send a helper to you," to his disciples. And his disciples wrote the Word of God. This is how God speaks to us today. There's no need for God to give direct revelation. And Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 is all we need. God says it one time, that's it, right? And so, in the past, he spoke directly. So here he's even speaking to these pagan men. And they have these dreams. And one of them, it was about 3 branches. And so Joseph, verse 12, interprets a dream and says, the 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will be put in Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner. And verse 14, remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. He's innocent. He's done nothing wrong. I'm doing you a favor. You're about to be restored, and when it comes to pass, please remember me. So he's confident in the fulfillment of this prophecy that he's just given them. Well, now, the chief baker, verse 16, he saw the interpretation was good, so hey, let me tell you about my dream. So he tells him about his dream. Unfortunately, for him, doesn't go so well. Verse 18, so Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets that you saw are 3 days. So he's thinking, all right, just like my friend, 3 days, my head's going to be lifted up. But no, that's not what he says. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree. Not exactly what I want to hear, right? Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. I find that interesting. They put that little tidbit in there. That he made a feast of all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief baker, and the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted. So Joseph is God's interpreter. He is portavoz, as we say in Spanish. He's carrying the voice of God. He's interpreting these dreams, and it comes true. But, verse 23, the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph is wronged again. All right. Now we go into chapter 41. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. This is a lesson in God's timing. You know, sometimes we want things to happen right away. Sometimes we pray, Lord, please take this cup from me. Lord, help me with this. If you'll just do this, if you'll. And sometimes, many times in my life, I look back and go, oh, now I see I needed to go through that, or I see the time frame there. I wanted that to go away right away, but instead, here we see God's timing. 2 more years, Joseph sits in prison. And then Pharaoh has a dream. We jump down because we're not going to have time to get through all this if I don't go fast. Verse 8, it says, it came to pass, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, but there was no one who could interpret the dream. The fact that he says his spirit is troubled shows that he understood this dream is a little more than just a bad dream. We've all had bad dreams and think, wow, that was a crazy dream. I love, sometimes I'll tell Andrea some of my crazy dreams and she just kind of looks at me like she's scared or something. Sometimes we have crazy dreams, that's all they are. But in this case, his spirit was troubled. He knew this was a little bit more. Then the chief butler, verse 9, spoke to Pharaoh, said, I remember my faults this day. And he begins to tell him about Joseph. So he remembers, oh yeah, I made a promise. I didn't keep that promise, so I remember my faults. So he's going to make good on the promise. So he tells him about this young Hebrew man, verse 12, and how he interpreted the dreams, and he recounts how that happened to Pharaoh. So verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. They shaved him, changed his clothes, and he comes to Pharaoh. Again, I love the little details that the Bible gives, which shows you just how real it is. Because you don't just go grab a dirty old prisoner and bring him into the chambers of the Pharaoh, the most powerful man on the planet. No, you're going to clean him up, you're going to get him presentable, and bring him in. Verse 15, he goes, I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. Now, think about that. You're standing in front of the most powerful man on the planet, and he says, I hear you can do some wonderful things, young man. Joseph easily could have said, in fact, I can, sir. Done it a few times. He could have lifted himself up. But notice what he says. This is a golden verse of the Bible right here. So Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Now, if you remember correctly, in the book of Daniel, the same sort of thing happened. Daniel is called before Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on the planet, has a dream. It's interesting how these patterns happen in the Bible. And he says, I hear you can interpret dreams. If you pay attention to the book, you'll notice that Daniel said the same thing. He says, not me, Nebuchadnezzar, O king. He goes, it's God who can do that. So giving God the glory right up front. So Pharaoh then tells him about this dream, about 7 cows, these fat cows that come up, and then there was these skinny cows, and I love how the Bible, again, 7 other cows, very ugly and gaunt. Ugliest cows I've ever seen. He goes, those ugly, skinny cows ate those fat cows, and it was like they didn't eat anything. And then he sees 7 grains, heads of grain come up, and they're full, and everything is flush and everything. And then there's these skinny grains that come up, and they consume the fat grains. So what does this mean? Verse 24, I told this to the magicians, but there is no one who could explain it to me. Now verses 25 through 28 is prophecy. This is miraculous working right here. God gives, in this case, Joseph, what's happening, and Joseph gives him the credit. Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. So both of your dreams are about the same thing. They're one dream. God has shown you, Pharaoh, what's about to happen. That's powerful words right there. To say this before this authority. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which come up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted with the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which God has spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do, what God is about to do. He's letting Pharaoh know, you know what? God's going to do a work here, and you better pay attention. Again, you see patterns in the Bible. That's one thing about the Bible you need to understand, is that the Bible is harmonious, and there are patterns that are repeated over and over, because there's going to be another time whenever someone's going to stand before Pharaoh in the same place probably and say, God's about to work a work, and you need to pay attention. And that would be Moses, right? Yeah, Moses, and there's a little bit different outcome with this Pharaoh. But this Pharaoh heeds the words, and what happens is Joseph says, let Pharaoh do this. So he gives Pharaoh knowledge. He lets him know what's about to happen, but then he gives him wisdom. What is wisdom? It's application of knowledge, right? So he says, what you need to do, he says in verse 33, let Pharaoh select discerning wise man and set him over all the land, and appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And as we gather these up, I'm going to summarize, as we gather these up, we will save those 7 years of grain and everything, so that when the 7 years of famine come, we can then survive these 7 years. Now he says take 1/5. That's a 20% tax. It's been interesting that some historians have looked up and said that Pharaoh typically took 10% tax of everything. If you lived in Egypt, you're going to pay 10% tax. 10% flat tax. Boy, that'd be great, wouldn't it? Just straight tax. So he doubles the tax in order to make up for this deficit that they're going to be feeling in a few years. And notice what happens. Verse 37, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servant. And Pharaoh said, can we find such a one as this man? And notice right here, underline it. In whom is the Spirit of God. Here's this authority that recognizes God's hand in this work. And he sees it in Joseph. And he says, this is a man of God. And as much as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. Y'all, that's a picture of Jesus right there. This is another thing about the Bible. There's these type and antitypes. There's these shadows and reality. And this is like a shadow of Jesus. Because what do they say about Jesus? Never have they heard anyone speak with such authority and wisdom. And here we see this picture in Joseph. You shall be over my house, and all people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And then he takes off his signet ring, which is a piece of authority. He then also puts on fine clothing and gives him a gold chain. And for 13 years, poor Joseph went from the pit to the pinnacle. He was down in a pit pleading for his life. Winds up in some of the most terrible situations for the last 13 years. And now here all of a sudden, boy, you talk about overnight things can change. He's now second in command. He even rides in the chariot behind Pharaoh. He changes his name, verse 45, to Joseph's name to Zaphanath-Paaneah, and gives him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph, verse 46, was 30 years old when he stood before the Pharaoh. And never lost his faith. That 13 years, he still remained faithful to God. Even at this opportunity before Pharaoh, he remains faithful to God. Great point, brother. All right, so now, verse 47 and down, we see where he does exactly what he said he's going to do. He takes all the grain, and in that time, verse 50, 2 sons were born to Joseph. One is the son of Manasseh, and he calls him that because it means, for God has made me forget all my toil of all my father's house. And then you have Ephraim, which means, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of affliction. Do you recognize those names, Manasseh and Ephraim? Those become 2 of the tribes of Israel. We don't have a tribe called Joseph, but we have 2 tribes called Ephraim and Manasseh. All right, so then verse 55, it comes to pass exactly what Joseph said would happen. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, it says, how do you know a prophet is a true prophet? Well, when his word comes to pass. That's how you know. And so here we see exactly what he said would happen. In verse 55, the land of Egypt was famished. The people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said, go to Joseph. And the famine was all over the face of the earth. Verse 57, so countries came to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was so severe. All right, so this saga just continues. Meanwhile, we've been over here with Joseph and all this stuff happening in Egypt with Joseph. Meanwhile, back down there in Canaan, verse 1 of chapter 42, when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, why do you look at one another? I love that. If I could do country boy talk, it's like, why are y'all standing around twiddling your thumbs? You know? Why are you just standing there looking silly at each other? He says, indeed, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. So go down to the place and buy us food there that we may live and not die. So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's, and this is his little brother, Benjamin, with his brothers, and said, lest some calamity befall him. I think Jacob's a little trigger shy, right? Last time he had his favorite son, his youngest son, his son of his favorite wife, go out with these boys. It didn't go so well. They bring back a bloody cloth and say that he was torn by some animals. And Jacob's heart's been broken ever since. And so he's like, you boys go and get us some grain. Oh, by the way, you're not taking my youngest boy. So there's still something going on there in his heart. So verse 6, Joseph's brothers come down and they did what? What does it say they do? Verse 6, the end of verse 6. What did Joseph's brothers do to him? Bow down. They bowed down. Oh, wait just a minute. Do you remember anything about Joseph in the beginning of his story? He had a dream. And that dream was, he said, I saw these stalks rise up and they all bowed down to me. I was one of the stalks. And then I had another dream, and the stars and the moon and everything, they bowed down to me. Well, it didn't take long for his brothers to figure out who he was talking about. Excuse me? It'd be like, I've got one little brother. All right, I'm the big brother. I know that. It'd be like my little brother coming to me and telling me, oh, I'm going to rule over you one day. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm the firstborn. I get the double portion. It goes to me first. What do you mean? They took offense to that. And that was especially important to the Hebrews. But now what has happened? Exactly what he said would happen. They're bowing down to him. They don't even know who he is. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. He said, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. So Joseph recognized his brothers. They did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them. See, there it is. Now notice, instead of saying, ha, 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 I told you, boys. I told you what was going to happen. No, something else happens. This is a little bit hard sometimes to understand. Some people want to look at this as if Joseph is getting revenge. Joseph, remember, has the Spirit of God upon him. This is not revenge. How this plays out, we don't know. Maybe it's God, but we know in the end, all things work, as Joseph says, that God made good out of it. You meant evil, but God made good. So he doesn't tell them who he is, but he accuses them of being spies. He says, y'all are spies. You've come here. And they said, no, we're not spies. We're honest men. And then he goes on, he says, verse 13, we have 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. In fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. One is no more. Who's that? That's Joseph. And he says, you're spies. And in this manner, he says, you shall be tested by the life, unless your youngest brother comes here. So one of y'all is going to stay here. The rest of y'all are going to go back, and you're going to bring that younger brother here. And then I'll know that you're telling the truth, that you're honest men. Joseph know what he's doing? This was all part of a plan. That's why we go back to beginning of a plan. This is all part of that beginning. All right, so let's bring your younger brother to me. Then verse 21, that's when the light bulb finally goes off. This is one of those light bulb moments, those epiphanies. Then they said to one another, these are the boys, the men, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear, therefore this distress has come upon us. They're remembering, oh no, this is when we threw Joseph in the well. Remember, he was crying out to us and we didn't do anything about it. And of course, there's always the one brother, right? And Reuben answered and said, did I not speak to you saying we shouldn't do that? I told you so. And he says, now his blood is required of us. The light bulb's gone off. They understand. And they're saying all this. This is the interesting thing. I love verse 23. They did not know that Joseph understood them. Remember, they're speaking Hebrew, and Joseph has been speaking Egyptian to them through an interpreter. The interpreters have been speaking Hebrew to them. So as far as they're concerned, they think that he can't understand them. So they turn around and they're speaking to each other in Hebrew. They said, I can't believe this is happening to us. And meanwhile, Joseph has every single word. By the way, a lot of people, when they hear people speaking Spanish and everything, like in a restaurant, a lot of people a lot of times will say to me, they're talking about us, aren't they? They're talking about us. And I can understand what they're saying. I'm like, no, they're talking about their bills. They're talking about they're talking about all the stuff we're talking about. They ain't talking about us. And it's interesting sometimes whenever you go in, especially being a gringo like me who speaks Spanish, and go into some place and a lot of people are speaking Spanish, and I'll turn around and I'll say something to them in Spanish, and the eyeballs is my favorite part when they go, you speak Spanish? I do. Joseph didn't do that. He maintained it, and he heard, but look what it did to him. Look what it did to him. Verse 24, he turned himself away from them and wept. Joseph's heart's breaking. All right, so they go back, and verse 30, the man who is Lord of the land spoke roughly to us. They took us for spies, they're telling their father. And then they go and they say that they need to leave one of our brothers here, take with them food for famine, bring your youngest brother to me, and then I'll do it. And Jacob, verse 36, said to them, you have bereaved me. Of all my children, Joseph is no more, Simon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin away? So what they did is they left Simeon back in jail, and they come home with all the food and everything, and that's a whole other interesting story about the money still in their sacks and all. And he says, they kept Simeon, and he's dealt real rough with us, and they want us to bring Benjamin down there. And Jacob's like, ain't happening. It's over. You're done. Reuben spoke to his father, fine, kill my two sons if I don't bring him back to you. And verse 38, my son shall not go down with you. Jacob's done. Ain't happening. All right, so now verse 1, chapter 43. So we get to a little bit different part of the story. The famine was severe in the land, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had bought from Egypt, that the father said to them, go back and buy us a little food. So if you have a whole bunch of grain, all right, I mean, let's just imagine you go to the grocery store, and Andrew and I go to the grocery store. A lot of times we'll buy enough food for a week, maybe 2 weeks. Yeah, that's typical, right? A lot of times we'll buy food for an extended period of time. Well, if you're going to get grain and stuff because you're starving to death, you're going to have a lot. And remember, there was 10 of them, so 9 come back with big old sacks of grain. It's been a considerable amount of time since they came home. Poor Simeon. He's sitting there in jail going, man, my brother's ever going to come back and get me? Meanwhile, they're down there. Well, the grain runs out. So Judah spoke to him and said, the man solemnly warned us, saying, you will not see my face unless your brother's with you. And then so Jacob goes on to say, really, we're going to do this again. But then Judah explains. He goes, basically verse 9, he says, I myself will be a surety. If you want us to go back down there, Dad, you got to send Benjamin, or we're not going to see the man again. I will be a surety. And then verse 14, after he says, take some of the, if you're going to do it, then take some things with you, and may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, and he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved. Finally, Jacob puts it in God's hands. If God's going to do it, God's going to do what God's going to do. So if I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved. So be it. It's dire times, difficult times, call for difficult measures. So they go down and they come up to Joseph's house. They're scared. They're a little worried. And they drew near, verse 19, the steward of Joseph's house. They talked with him and they said, hey, we're back. We want to get some more grain, if I can summarize here. And we brought all the money that we brought the first time. I think there was a mistake made. Y'all put our money in our sacks. So we brought that back and more money and more gifts in order to buy grain. And verse 23, peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Listen to what he says. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. Then he brought Simeon out to them. So this servant, here's things that we don't think about sometimes. As Richard says many times, we read over the Bible. How did that servant come to know about God? And how did he know that God provided these things? He learned it from Joseph. So even Joseph has had an impact on the household that he's over. So the man brought the men into Joseph, verse 24, gave them water, washed their feet, and they made a present ready for Joseph's coming, and they heard they were going to eat bread there. They bowed down before him at the end of verse 26. Then he asked them, is your father well? Is he still alive? And they said, your servant, our father, is good in good health. He is still alive. And then he says, is this your younger brother? And he brings him to him, and now verse 30, his heart yearned for his brother. Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. So there's partly tears of joy, partly tears of all this history he's dealing with, but he runs out of the room because he doesn't want to see him crying. He washes his face. So he set him a place for himself, verse 32, then themselves. So there's a table for Joseph, a table for his brothers, and a table for the Egyptians. And they were eating they lined them up according to their birth. All right, so the firstborn here and then all the way down. And at the end of verse 33, the men looked in astonishment at one another. Wouldn't you? I mean, come on. Last time you were there, he treated you very roughly. He threatened to kill you. He takes one of your brothers, says, bring the other one, your spies, and all this other stuff. And now all of a sudden, you wind up this money in your bag. You bring the money back. They say, no, don't worry. It's no big deal. In fact, come on in and have dinner with us. And they bring Simeon out. And all the men are just kind of like, what is going on here? It's kind of a strange... See what I mean? You can't make movies better than this, right? Isn't this a great movie? This is a great movie. I don't know of any movie better than this. All right, so then I'm going to have to speed up here. In chapter 44, he puts a cup in there, and then they go off, and Joseph sends his servant out and says, why are you repaying evil for good? And then they bring them all back and everything, and they search it. Notice what happens. Verse 12, they searched and began with the oldest and left off with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Look what happens next. They tore their clothes. Man, you talk about an emotional roller coaster. First, it's all this bad stuff, and then they promise, that, okay, we'll take care of Benjamin. They go back down expecting to be treated roughly again. They wind up going to dinner and keep their money. Now they got their sacks of grain again, and they're leaving to go. And then now, here's a cup that's been stolen by Benjamin. Would you rip your clothes too? That's part of also the emotion that Hebrews show. You'll see that over and over throughout the Bible, how they'll rip their clothes as a sign of anguish. All right. Verse 16 is a powerful verse. Then Judah said, what shall we say, my Lord? So they've been caught, and Judah just says, all right, Joseph. He doesn't know it's Joseph, but all right. What shall we say, my Lord? What shall we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Does God know your iniquity? So this is a picture of God. So Judah comes near to him and he says, listen, you told us this. You asked us to do that. We did this. Recounting the whole story. And he goes, I'm begging you. He says, please take me. Let Benjamin go back, because if you don't, it's going to kill my dad. It's going to break my dad's heart. He is going to die. Please, please. Verse 1, chapter 45, Joseph could not restrain himself before those who stood by, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. So he makes all the Egyptians leave. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And they cried. They didn't believe it at first. And so he says, come near. He goes, I am your brother whom you sold in Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve your life. Verse 7, and God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and save your lives from this great deliverance. So I'll tell you what, go back home, get Dad, get the rest of the family, bring them here, and we're going to put you in the best land, and we're going to make all of this good. And so even whenever the family comes, they find out the report goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh finds out about it. And he even says, yes, bring your family. We'll give them the best land. Boy, there's a great relationship between Pharaoh and Joseph, isn't there? And then they bring him down. So chapter 46, verse 1, Israel took his journey with all that he had, and God spoke to Israel and said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt. I will make you a great nation there. Verse 8 and forward counts all the different children of Israel. And then chapter 47, verse 7, they all get there. And Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. This man comes in. And I love, once again, the Bible. Look at what Pharaoh says. The first question that Pharaoh says to him, how old are you? He's impressed by this man. He knows it's Joseph's father, and he's impressed. This man, and notice what Jacob says, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Y'all ever met a 130-year-old man? I'm telling you, you'd be asking the same question. How old are you? Right? And he says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimage. You think I'm old? You used to see my dad and my granddad. They're even older. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from Pharaoh, and they put him in the best land. And then when the time drew near for Jacob to die, he calls his sons to him. In the last few chapters you can see there, Jacob blesses his sons. There's an interesting story in there in chapter 49 where Joseph brings his sons in and he sets his oldest on the right hand and he sets his youngest on the left hand. And then Jacob goes to bless the two boys and he does this. And Joseph gets upset and says, Dad, no, you got it backwards. And Jacob responds, no, I know what I'm doing. I know, son. He says, this one's going to be a greater nation than this one. So he knew exactly what he's doing. He goes on then to bless his children. He says to Reuben, Reuben, you're my firstborn. But because you slept with my concubines, my wives, he says, it's been taken from you. Levi and was it Simeon? I've already lost I believe it's Levi and Simeon. He says, because of what y'all did, basically what happened in Shechem, he says, you did an evil thing. You did an evil thing. Simeon and Levi, he says, basically, cursed be the anger of its fierce, the wrath. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter you across Israel. And that's exactly what happened to those two tribes. But then to Judah. Judah's done a good thing, right? He took care of Benjamin. He took care of Joseph. He says, your brothers will praise you. And here's your prophecy, verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. From whom did the Messiah come? Tribe of Judah. This is what it's saying. The scepter, the ruler, the one who will have the power and authority, and those who will bow down, it shall come from you, Judah. He goes on to bless all of them, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Naphtali, and have Joseph, the two boys, and Benjamin. And all of these, it says, verse 28, are the 12 tribes of Israel. He charged them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Hittite. He asked Joseph, please don't let me die in Egypt, or don't let me be buried in Egypt, but take me back to Canaan. Bury me with my dad and my mom. And indeed, that's what happens. And then you have this beautiful story of Pharaoh allowing Joseph to take Jacob back, and he buries his dad in that cave, Machpelah, and then he comes back and ends the rest of his days there in Egypt. You can't make a movie better than that. What an incredible story. And I just touched the hem of the garment. Go back and read this story. Go back and read the story of Joseph and think about it as if you're watching a blockbuster movie, because, man, so much drama, so many wonderful things that happen in there, and it's all about God's power. It is the beginning of a plan. That plan, whenever Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God worked it for good. God was there the whole time. So I hope this has encouraged you. We've run out of time, and we're now going to take a break and prepare for our worship service. And thank you very much for your kind attention.